All right, now the next step. When we click on an item, we want to highlight it. To do that, we have a CSS class in Bootstrap called active. So back to our code. This is where we are rendering a list item. I'm going to give this a second class called active. Now, look, all of them are highlighted or activated. This is not what we want. We want to highlight one item at a time. To do that, we need a variable to keep track of the index of the selected item. So back to our component. Let's declare a variable called selected index. We can initialize this to -1. That means no item is selected. If we set this to 0, that means the first item should be selected. Now, down here, we can render this active class dynamically. So we're going to use the same technique you learned in the conditional rendering lesson. So I'm going to remove the quotations. Here we add braces. So we render content dynamically. Here we can check the selected index. If it equals the index of the current item, that means that item should be active. So we're going to give it two classes, list, group, item, and active. Otherwise, we should only give it the list, group, item class. This is a very simple way to add classes dynamically. There are other more advanced techniques. Let's not worry about them at this stage. Let's just see if this works or not. So back to the browser. Now the first item is selected. Beautiful. Now when we click on an item, we should change the selected index. So this is where we're handling the click event. Now in this case, we need a simple arrow function to update the selected index. So I'm going to get rid of this handle click function. So we delete it from here, as well as here. We should also delete the mouse event import on the top. Okay, so always pay attention to cleaning up your code. So here we write a simple arrow function, and here we set selected index to the index of the current item. Okay, now back to the browser. Let's click on an item. Nothing is happening. Why is that? Well, this variable we have declared here is local to this function component. So React is not aware of it. It's like a little secret inside this component. To solve this problem, we should tell React that this component is going to have data or state that might change over time. And to do that, we have to use one of the built-in functions in React called useState. So when we type this here and press enter, it gets imported on the top. Okay. Now this function is called a hook. A hook is a function that allows us to tap into built-in features in React. So this is called the state hook. We have other hooks that you will learn about as we go through this course. Using the state hook, we can tell React that this component can have data or state that will change over time. So instead of declaring a variable this way, we're going to call this function. Now we're going to initialize our variable. We can give it the initial value of -1. Now this returns an array. In this array, we're going to have two elements. The first element is going to be a variable, like our selected index variable. And the second element is going to be an updater function. Using that updater function, we can update this variable, and at that point, React will be notified, so it knows that the state of our component is changed, and then it will re-render our component, which causes the DOM to be updated under the hood. So as I told you earlier in the course, with React, we almost never have to touch the DOM directly. We think in terms of components that have state. When the state of a component changes, React will update the DOM to match the new component state. Okay. Now let's see how we can use this. So instead of working with two individual elements here, it's easier to destructure this array into two elements. So the first element is going to be selected index, and the second element is going to be a function which we call set selected index. This is a convention we follow in React applications. So here we have a state variable called selected index, and here we have a function called set selected index. Now, as another example, we can use the state hook to declare another variable called name. So we call useState. We can initialize the name to an empty string. This returns an array which we can destructure into two elements, name and set name. That's the idea. Now, in this case, we don't need a name variable, so let's delete this line and the comment and this line. So here we have a state variable called selected index. Now down here, to update this variable, we're going to call set selected index and give it the new index. With this, when we click on an item, it gets selected. Beautiful. So this is how we tell React that our component can have state that will change over time. Now, one thing you need to know about component state is that each component is going to have its own state. So if we go back to our app component and add another instance of our list group here, each list group is going to have its own state. So in our first list group, Paris is selected, but in our second list group, nothing is selected because this component has its own state. So they will be independent of each other, okay? Now, we don't need two list groups here, so I'm going to remove the second one.